Hello, my name is Labria Rainey, and today, in 60-minute style interview segment, we will be discussing comprehensive sex education and some of the topics that follow as consent, sexual violence, the watered down teachings within the public school system, and the impacts of such topics. Today, my guest and I will be talking about these topics. However, she will not be able to show her face due to circumstances, but her voice will be permeated throughout the entire segment. Thank you for being with me today.
I'm glad you joined me today.
So let's just get started with the whole entire segment. How has consent, the topic that I discussed just now, um, impacted you throughout your life, throughout sex education, and just throughout your adult years?
Okay, as far as sex education in public school, I think it was a means to an end to check a box. The curriculum to me was very sterile, that promoted number one abstinence, and then if that didn't stick, I think the purpose was to shock students by showing them the most outrageous or more extreme cases of sexually transmitted infections and diseases, to, in a way to dissuade um, young people from engaging in sex. But I don't know if consent specifically was a big part of that.
And following from sex education into your life, how has your view of consent being added to what you learned at such an age impacted your life or events within your life?
As far as consent, consent is one of the most important topics that generally is not talked about. And I take it even further out of the sexual context. Consent, as in having autonomy over your individual person, whether you're a little kid who's seeing a distant relative and you're encouraged to go give them a hug when they're a stranger to you, to then it can go into being in a relationship and you really don't want to do something sexually or otherwise, but you go along for the sake of being in a relationship. um, Legally, silence shouldn't be consent, and that is not something that is actually taught. The opposite is taught. Like if you're not, boisterous saying no, then it's assumed that consent is given. When that is one of the biggest problems we have, because it shouldn't be that way.
And relating such topic as consent leads to our other topic of sexual violence, which is very at high levels within our country due to statistic wise and to personal experience wise, as I've been told by our producers of the show. Um, Comfortably enough, would you be able to tell us about how such sexual violence, either taught or experienced, has impacted your life?
Um, Sexual violence is something, you hear about it on the TV. I mean, and unfortunately, you have friends and loved ones who experience different, varying, various types of sexual violence in a lifetime, unfortunately. Um, Not to repeat everything I said earlier, but I think it harkens back to consent in that people have to have control of their personal, have autonomy over their body and over who they are. And sexual violence and violence in general is prevalent in people that are in relationship, whether it's you know uh, a sexual relationship or some type of relationship where one person has more control over the other. And because there are not boundaries, or boundaries aren't always respected, then people assume by virtue of having this relationship with a person, they could take a step further and engage in sexual violence or other type of violence that they think are appropriate. It's kind of dehumanizing the would be victim in, just taking the control over. They don't have control or personal autonomy over their own body and what occurs. Just because someone is you've engaged in a sexual relationship with somebody at one point, that doesn't mean that it will continue to be that way. I know going back to consent in that regard, consent is be realistic. People are not going to just stop in the heat of passion and stuff and want to have this drawn out conversation. Do you consent? Yes, I consent, and the like. But honestly, those conversations need to be had. Just because someone doesn't say no, that does not mean consent. And I think that's where some trouble come in. That's a step in relationships or engaging others that a lot of people were not taught, and is not talked about. But as far as sexual violence and the like, people thinking that consent isn't necessary, they step over other people's boundaries, and then some are ultimately shocked that someone, when they accuse them of some kind of violence or report them, they didn't. In some instances, they may not even know. They're just going along with what they're accustomed to and what has worked out before. When truly you've overstepped someone's boundary, and an unfortunate situation or a drastic situation has occurred just because you didn't respect someone's boundaries. So I think consent and sexual violence is very interwoven, simply because the lack of, people don't focus on that, and it gets you to a dangerous place.
Very dangerous indeed. One of our final topics that I will be talking about is the overall impact of such topic as consent, sexual violence, and the sex education taught within our public school system. Now, newer research has showed a lot of the impact demographics towards the watered down teachings, the lack of understanding truly consent, and sexual violence that's not talked about as much. There's a linkage towards a higher demographic that's kind of a newer study that came out. Black girls and the adultification of black girls. The studio producer audience, we found that this type of topic in this discussion that we're having right now is so much needed, but I wanted to see your standpoint of how the lack of knowledge of consent, the lack of knowledge of the impacts of sexual violence on people as young and as old as younger adults, how it impacts that demographic as seen as young girl, but the intersection of being black.
I don't. First and foremost, thank you for the question, but I don't speak for all black people, but as a black woman, what I can say is, yes, young black girls, there are many studies out there that show the adultification of them, meaning even when they're in their teens, preteens, and as they develop, people prescribe more adult kind of attributes to them as opposed to their peers in other racial groups. Case in point, the type of clothes they wear. They can wear same clothes as other people that are more, athletically, more people that are, may have a different build,